At dawn, the snow came sideways across the Wyoming flats, thin as ash, stinging the eyes and whitening the world without mercy. The land lay open and unsheltered, a hard table of frozen grass and broken fence, where sound traveled far and help rarely did. A single ranch house crouched against the wind, its boards gray with age, its windows dim, its chimney smoking low as if afraid of the sky. Inside that weather stood Jonah Creed, a cowboy past his best years, pulling on cracked gloves and listening to the quiet that had followed him for months. He moved the way men do when they expect nothing to change. Each step was measured, careful of old injuries, careful of hope. The barn waited beyond the yard, long and narrow, ribs showing through warped planks. It used to be loud at this hour, horses stamping, metal ringing, voices calling. Now it answered him with a hollow breath. Jonah paused before the door, feeling the cold through his boots, feeling the weight of the key in his pocket like a small accusation. Once this place had promised a future. Jonah had believed in work and weather and time, believed that if a man kept faith with the land, it would keep faith with him. That belief had thinned, season by season, until it was little more than habit. The bank notices lay folded on the kitchen table, edges soft from handling. He did not read them anymore. He knew their language. It spoke of numbers and deadlines, not of storms or flesh or the stubborn grace of animals. He crossed the yard and opened the barn. Light fell on a pale blade, revealing empty stalls and a scatter of old hay. The smell of leather lingered, though the saddles were gone. Jonah stood and breathed, letting the past settle, then lifted a fork and set to work, because work was what kept the thoughts from crowding in. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls and slid away, impatient. That was when he heard it. Not the wind, not the creak of boards. A sound low and rough, carried on the air like a question that refused to be ignored. Jonah froze, fork resting against his shoulder. The sound came again, distant but deliberate, a voice shaped by need. He listened, counting the space between calls, feeling something tighten behind his ribs. He told himself it was nothing. Out here, sounds traveled and lied. He turned back to the stall, lifted hay, shook it loose. The sound came closer. It was joined by another, then another, uneven and strained. Jonah set the fork down. He did not sigh. He did not curse. He simply stood, knowing the day had already shifted its weight. He stepped back into the yard. Snow dusted his hat and gathered in the seams of his coat. Beyond the fence, three shapes moved against the white, small and stubborn, pushing forward with the patience of creatures who had learned not to rush. They were donkeys, their coats matted with ice, heads low, breath burning holes in the air. Each carried a pack, lashed tight, the ropes dark with wet. Jonah watched them come, measuring distance, measuring cost. Donkeys were not common here, not this far out, not in weather like this. He saw the tremor in their legs, the way the smallest lagged, the way the oldest favored a hind foot. He felt the familiar calculation begin, the one that asked what he could afford, what he could lose. He felt, too, the older answer rising, the one that had once made decisions simple. The donkeys stopped at the fence and waited. They did not bray. They did not push. Snow gathered along their backs, quiet as resignation. Jonah walked closer, boots crunching, heart steady. He could turn away. He could close the door and let the storm finish what had started. No one would know. The land would not judge him. It never did. He reached the gate and rested his hand on the wood. The smallest donkey lifted its head and met his eyes. There was no fear there, only endurance. Jonah felt the key in his pocket again, heavy as choice. Somewhere beyond the flats, someone had let these animals go, trusting the road, trusting luck. Somewhere closer, a man stood between warmth and cold, counting what was left of himself. The wind eased just for a moment, as if the world were listening. Jonah opened the gate. The hinges cried out, thin and sharp, and the sound seemed to carry for miles. He stepped aside and waited, not knowing yet what he had agreed to, only that the quiet had finally asked him something he could not refuse. The barn door stood open behind him, spilling warmth into the storm like a small, stubborn promise. Jonah watched the donkeys step through the gate, one by one, hooves slipping, packs swaying with careful balance. He noticed the knots, practical and hurried, and the way the ropes bit into hair already rubbed raw. Whoever had tied them knew enough to make them hold, not enough to make them kind. Jonah closed the gate after them and listened as the wind filled the space it left behind. He did not know their road or their purpose. He knew only that they had come straight to his door, as if guided by something older than maps. Inside the barn, light and shadow broke across their sides, revealing scars that told of miles and burden. Jonah felt the cold finally reach his bones, then pass. He took a breath and understood, without naming it, that this morning would ask more of him than shelter. It would ask for memory and judgment and the courage to stand where others had moved on. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and exacting. Inside, 3 animals waited, while a man stood between his past and a choice. That could change everything today. Jonah led the donkeys into the barn without touching them, giving them room to decide the shape of their own safety. They crossed the threshold slowly, hooves clacking on the frozen boards, noses lifting as the warmer air met their lungs. Steam rose from their coats, sharp and alive, carrying the sour-sweet smell of long travel. Jonah closed the door against the wind and leaned his weight into it, feeling the storm press back, denied. He struck a match and lit the lantern. The flame steadied, throwing a low amber glow that softened the barn's hard angles. In that light, the donkeys became individuals. The oldest stood apart, broad-chested, with a white blaze dulled by grime and a deep notch torn from one ear. The middle one watched Jonah with a steady, measuring gaze, head cocked as if weighing a bargain. The smallest swayed, knees trembling, ribs sharp beneath a coat rubbed thin by rope. Jonah set hay down and stepped back. They did not rush. They chewed with care, as though mindful of how easily things could be taken away. He fetched water from the pump, the handle stiff with ice, and filled a trough. The sound of drinking filled the barn, urgent then easing, a rhythm that slowed his breathing. Jonah's hands moved on their own, muscle and memory, guiding him through motions learned long ago. He kept his eyes on the floor, because looking too closely made him remember faces he had once known, animals he had failed to save when the winter ran longer than the money. When he finally looked, he saw the packs. They were balanced across each donkey's back, wrapped in oilcloth and burlap, tied with rope knotted tight and plain. The ropes had been adjusted mid-journey, marks showing where someone had tightened and retied with cold fingers. Jonah felt a prick of unease. Out here, packs meant purpose. They meant a plan that had gone wrong. He circled the donkeys slowly, speaking under his breath the way men do when they want animals to know they are seen. The middle donkey shifted to keep its side between Jonah and the pack, a small, telling movement. Jonah stopped. He had no right to touch what was not his. He had no strength left for trouble. He told himself this was a pause, not a refusal. The smallest donkey stumbled, its foreleg buckling. Jonah stepped forward without thinking, shoulder-braced, steadying the animal until the tremor passed. He felt bone beneath his palm, felt heat and hunger and the fragile insistence of life. The donkey leaned into him, trusting the weight it could not carry alone. Jonah swallowed and nodded, as if the animal had asked him a question he could answer. He fetched a blanket from the tack room, one of the few things the bank had not taken, and laid it across the smallest back. The donkey sighed, a sound so human it startled him. Jonah laughed once, short and surprised, then stopped. He remembered laughing with his boy in this same barn, remembered a winter before the drought, before the letters stopped coming. The memory hurt, but did not undo him. He knelt by the oldest donkey and examined the lame foot. The hoof was split, packed with ice and dirt. Jonah warmed it with his hands, picked it clean with the tip of his knife, and wrapped it in cloth torn from a feed sack. The donkey did not flinch. It stood and endured, eyes half-lidded, as if pain had long ago become a language it spoke fluently. The middle donkey watched everything. When Jonah reached toward its pack, it stamped once, not threatening, just firm. Jonah withdrew his hand. "All right," he said aloud. testing the sound of his voice. "We'll do this proper." He sat back on his heels and waited, letting the minutes stretch. Outside, the wind worried the eaves. Inside, the lantern hummed. After a while, the middle donkey stepped closer. It lowered its head and nudged Jonah's knee, then turned, offering the pack. The gesture was small, but it carried a weight Jonah felt in his chest. He reached out, slow and open, and laid his hand on the rope. It was cold, stiff, tied by someone who knew the cost of not coming loose. He did not untie it. Not yet. He rested his palm there, feeling the burden through cloth and cord, sensing the care taken to keep it dry, intact, delivered. Whoever had set these animals on the road had trusted the road to finish the work. Jonah sat with that trust and felt the old argument rise again, the one between caution and obligation. He stood and moved to the door, lifting the latch and cracking it open just enough to listen. The storm had eased to a whisper. The flats lay quiet, unclaimed. Jonah closed the door and turned back. He set another lantern alight, brightening the space, making a promise to stay awake. He pulled a stool close and rested his elbows on his knees, watching the donkeys eat and drink and settle. Their breathing evened. The smallest lay down, folding itself with care, the blanket slipping just so. Jonah's shoulders loosened. He felt the long day settle into his bones, and, beneath it, a thinner feeling he recognized as resolve. At last, he reached for the knife again. He cut the first knot clean and paused, listening for a sound beyond the barn, a shout or a footstep that would claim what he was about to touch. Nothing came. Jonah drew the rope free and peeled back the oilcloth. He did not yet see what lay beneath, only the careful wrapping and the intention it held. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed, knowing the door he had left open was no longer just the barn's, and that whatever these animals carried had already chosen him. The night waited as the truth prepared itself. Jonah loosened the oilcloth with care, folding it back as if the night itself might be listening. Inside the pack lay not gold or weapons, but order: tins wrapped in wool, glass vials cushioned in straw, paper sealed in wax, and tucked into a leather sleeve. The sight slowed him. This was not cargo meant for trade or theft. It was cargo meant to arrive. He lifted a tin and felt its weight, precise and intentional, then set it down again, unwilling to disturb the balance too quickly. He opened the leather sleeve and read by lantern light. Names were written in a firm, spare hand, each followed by a place that made his brow tighten. These were not towns, not properly. They were homesteads, mining camps, a schoolhouse that only opened when weather allowed. Each name carried a date already passed. Jonah's jaw set. He had lived long enough to know what missed dates meant in winter. He opened the second pack. More of the same. Medicine, bandages, letters folded small to fit the space, each addressed carefully, as if care itself could be preserved in paper. The third pack held fewer supplies, but heavier ones, wrapped against the cold with particular attention. Jonah did not need labels to understand their purpose. He had buried neighbors for lack of such things. He sat back on the stool and let the truth assemble itself without hurry. Somewhere down the line, a route had been cut short. Someone had weighed cost against distance and chosen the ledger over the land. The donkeys had been the answer to a problem, quiet and efficient, until the storm turned them into an inconvenience. Jonah pictured a man closing a door much like his own, believing the work finished. The lantern hissed softly. Jonah read one letter aloud, his voice roughened by disuse. It was from a woman thanking a doctor she had never met, promising a pie when spring came, apologizing for the trouble. Jonah stopped before the end. He folded the letter back into its place, feeling the heat rise behind his eyes and pass. He stood and paced the length of the barn, boots scuffing straw. He did not curse the men who had sent the donkeys out. Cursing would not mend what was broken. He thought instead of the way systems grew careless, how distance made decisions easy. He thought of the road and the miles between here and the names on those pages. Jonah stepped outside and studied the sky. The storm had spent itself, leaving a brittle calm. Stars burned through thin cloud, sharp and indifferent. He imagined the route the donkeys must have taken, the cut across the flats, the shelter found and lost. He imagined the hands that had tied the knots, the moment when someone decided to trust animals more than weather. Back inside, the middle donkey shifted and met his gaze. Jonah crouched and laid his hand on its neck. "You kept going," he said, not as praise but as fact. The donkey flicked an ear, accepting the statement. Jonah smiled despite himself. Endurance recognized endurance. He sorted the supplies, counting and recounting, matching names to parcels. Each match made the burden clearer. He found a ledger tucked into the smallest pack, its cover stained and split. Inside were marks and dates, notes about deliveries made and missed, the neat accounting of a job half done. The last entry ended 2 days before the storm. Jonah traced the line with his finger, then closed the book. He considered sending word, but to whom? The company's mark was on the ledger, a brand he recognized from notices tacked in town. He had seen their wagons roll through when times were better, had watched them promise efficiency like salvation. He knew what would happen if he sent a message now. Papers would be shuffled. Responsibility would be thinned until it vanished. Jonah set the ledger aside and poured himself coffee from the pot kept warm at the stove. The bitterness steadied him. He thought of the people named on those pages, waiting by windows that rattled in the night, counting breaths and hours. He thought of his boy, long gone, and the way Jonah had once believed leaving was the same as surviving. He moved to the door again and opened it wider. The cold rushed in, honest and bracing. The road lay empty, pale as bone. Jonah closed the door and leaned against it, the decision settling without ceremony. He would not hand this back to a system that had already let go. He would not pretend ignorance. He returned to the donkeys and began to retie the packs, adjusting the load, easing the strain where he could. He worked methodically, the way he always had, making small improvements that mattered. When he finished, he stood and looked at them, 3 lives bound to a task bigger than themselves. Jonah banked the lantern and sat in the dim, listening to the animals breathe. The barn felt different now, charged with purpose. He knew the road would be hard. He knew the weather would turn again. He also knew that some things, once uncovered, refused to be buried. Outside, the night held its distance. Inside, the truth waited, patient as the donkeys, for morning and a man willing to carry it forward. Morning came thin and pale, the kind that promised light without mercy. Jonah rose before the frost loosened its grip, his joints aching as if they remembered every mile he had ever walked. He moved through the barn with practiced economy, hitching the donkeys while their breath clouded the dim air. They stood steady now, rested but alert, as if the road still hummed beneath their hooves. Jonah shifted the packs from their backs to a low sled, easing the weight with care, and stepped outside into a sky washed the color of old tin. The road east lay hard and shining, a narrow ribbon cut through frozen grass. Jonah set out at a measured pace, the donkeys flanking the sled, their ears turning to the sound of the runners. He felt eyes on him from the land itself, the quiet scrutiny of a place that had seen men try and fail and try again. Each step forward pressed the truth closer to the surface, until he could no longer pretend this was only shelter given and repaid. The first homestead crouched behind a line of cottonwoods stripped bare by winter. Jonah knocked once, then waited, hearing movement inside, cautious and slow. A woman opened the door, her face drawn tight by worry and cold. He spoke her name and held out the parcel. Her hands shook as she took it, fingers lingering on the twine as if to prove it was real. She did not weep. She stepped aside and let him see the fire burning low, the proof of a life held together by patience. Jonah tipped his hat and left before gratitude could turn into something heavier. By midday, he reached the mining camp, where men paused in their labor to watch him pass. Their questions stayed unasked, swallowed by the sight of medicine carried honest and plain. Jonah delivered each bundle as written, reading names aloud, matching ink to faces. The donkeys walked lighter with every stop, their burdens shrinking until only purpose remained. Jonah felt it too, the narrowing of doubt into resolve. On the second night, a rider found him camped by a stand of juniper. The man wore a coat marked with a brand Jonah recognized, the emblem of efficiency pressed onto wool. He spoke of contracts and weather, of miscalculations and regret. Jonah listened, saying nothing, and handed him the ledger. The writer read by firelight, jaw tightening as dates and omissions aligned. He closed the book without argument, the matter settled by facts no speech could soften. The final delivery lay farthest out, at a schoolhouse shuddered against the cold. Inside, a boy lay wrapped in quilts, his breath shallow, eyes bright with fever. Jonah placed the medicine within reach and stepped back, giving space for hope to work. The teacher's thanks broke in her throat. Jonah left quietly, the door closing behind him with a sound like relief. When he turned for home, the sky had cleared, wide and indifferent. The road back felt shorter, though his body carried every mile. The donkeys followed without urging, their task complete. At the ranch, Jonah unhitched them and let them choose their stalls. He sat on the step and watched the light fade, feeling a tiredness that was clean, earned. In the weeks that followed, wagons returned to the road, routes restored, promises spoken softer. No one named Jonah for what he had done. The land did not change its rules, but the barn filled again with sound and movement, with animals passing through and people willing to help. One evening, as snow fell straight and gentle, Jonah closed the barn door halfway and left it there. He watched the donkeys breathe and understood that kindness had not conquered the world. It had only refused to abandon it, and that was enough to let the light back in.